Hello and welcome to Issues and Ideas. I'm Chris DeBello. Well, they try. The White House staff, they really try. They send Donald Trump out there. He was out in Las Vegas giving a talk about the economy, and that's what they want him to focus on. Tell the people, tell the voters, tell the Republican voters, you're focused on making things good with the economy. There's stuff that needs to be worked on. There's stuff that needs to change, and you're giving all the focus it possibly could have so those changes and the economy will be better for everybody. That's what they want him to do. It didn't work out that way.
I saw polls today on television that say Donald Trump polls on the economy aren't good. The economy is the greatest economy we've ever had by far. The economy aren't good. They're fake polls, just like fake writers. I took over the country. The prices were through the roof. In my first day, the press said, what are you going to do about affordability? It was a word they devised, affordability. No, they never used that word before.
Just a couple of days after that speech, jobs report came out. The expectation was a gain of 83,000. There was a loss of 23,000, plus the June numbers were revised down another 20,000, and the workforce participation rate at, I think it was a 5-year low now. And he falls back on his new scare tactic. They're socialists, but they're really communists. Pushes New York City Mayor Mondami and El Fayad, who won the Democratic primary in Michigan. Now, you might not think this is sticking. It's just reaching back like everything else at an increasing level Trump does. He looks to the past to drag it up to the future and try to get the same results, if there were any results from what he pulls up from the past. You might think it's not working. It's failing miserably. Well, guess again. A little telltale sign about this. Here's Nevada Governor Joe Lombardo. He wanted to pause before Trump took to the stage to pay honor and tribute to a fallen Las Vegas police officer. Check out what happened.
So I know Pastor Tice spoke about Officer Abdel Nabi a few moments ago. No, we're not booing him. He's the officer that passed away here recently. And I asked if we had a moment of silence, and he said we had not. So I would like your indulgence for a moment of silence for Officer Austin.
See, some people are buying what Trump's selling. As the war with Iran continues, and of course the numerous repeated claims of a win by the U.S. are made, the entire matter is seen as something that's over there. Well, is that accurate? Has the war gotten closer to America than some believe? Well, there are some who are growing to believe it has, and they turn to the recent series of cyber attacks against U.S. water systems, as an increasing number of states as proof of that. My first guest today joins us to explain how these attacks are being done, whether they endanger U.S. water supplies, and the ways they alert those whose responsibility it is to oversee these systems. He is a cybersecurity expert, CEO of Vigilant. Chris Nyhuis, how are you today, Chris?
Doing great, Chris. Thanks for having me on.
And learn more about the services of Vigilant, vigilantnow.com. We do have the link at our homepage. Well, I guess, Chris, if you're the enemy looking for targets, water systems in America are pretty much out there and easy to find. There's 150,000 different systems, all different sizes. But by and large, I guess maybe a rare exception, they all operate off of what's called a programmable logic controller system, which I'm doing the background for this segment, and made me think back to the movie The China Syndrome, when you looked at all the machinery that was going on, the hardware and people manning consoles. It's not that way anymore, is it?
It's not that way anymore, no. And the PLC, if you think about it, just for your listeners, we all have thermostats in our house that are connected to our furnaces, and we can connect them remotely through apps now. We don't even have to be home to connect it. It's very similar to what you were just saying there, is that in the past we had to be at our house to set that thermostat. Now you don't have to, right? You can set it through Nest or whatever, and it's the exact same thing. So think of like a thermostat-like device, but on a water system control, like a valve, or some sort, just a control that controls the chemicals that come in. Those used to all be manual. Everyone was sitting at a screen. Now they can connect to it remotely through modems or internet connections or things like that.
And that goes into something else I found in researching, too. There are different ways to attack these systems, to the point where if you're monitoring, as you detailed, you could see everything, all the levels, all the meters looking fine, but the attack that's going on makes that observer or supervisor blind to what's really going on.
Oh, 100%. Now, I started my career, this is not a new thing. This has been going on for decades. I started my career in IT and cyber at a frozen food warehousing company, and a lot of supply chain of frozen food goes through those organizations. And we saw attacks 20 years ago where attackers were trying to open up valves to release ammonia into the atmosphere, right, which can melt people's lungs and things like that. So, it's not very good either. And so in those cases, for the last decades here, these attackers have been really honing in their skill on misinformation, right? So, they can make a cyber detection technology, or they can make a screen, show one thing, but really it's showing something else. And the reason they can do that is because when you control these PLCs, you're controlling the information coming in and out of them, and you can make it look like whatever you want to.
I'm not saying this to put the hammer down on operators of smaller systems, but it's a safe assumption that those who operate in more rural areas might not have the experience, the knowledge, the awareness that someone even in a large city has. But even those larger systems are under attack too. So seems like this is really exposing a lot of vulnerabilities in the water plant systems.
It is, yeah. I mean, we as a nation, there's a book called The Bomber Mafia. That's a fascinating book, but it talked about the war effort in World War II and how, we as a country realized that if we could take out the ball bearing plants in Germany, we could shut down their entire war effort, because the same ball bearings were in tanks and trucks and their guns and their airplanes. So we started attacking their ball bearing plants. And whenever you conduct warfare, you just need to look at what's, a couple things. What's the easiest way to shut down the war machine? Or two, what's the easiest way to cause chaos for the people, that are behind that war machine? And when you look at things like water systems, you look at ammonia control systems, you look at all the things that control just our food delivery, we're fairly vulnerable in that, because to what you just said, it's, a lot of these are rural areas. It isn't that the skill set of these technicians are lower. It's that they don't have the resources. It might be one person manning an entire water district. A lot of the cyber technology that exists today, I would say, is not as effective as it was 15 years ago. I think we're actually less effective in a lot of the cyber tech that's out there. And so a lot of the ways to detect and understand and see these attacks have been diminished. And I'll even say this, the attacks that are happening against these districts are not always sophisticated attacks. They're general attacks that take place. It's just the protections, or, even like with us, a lot of these PLCs are connected directly to the internet. And so, if you can get to these old, antiquated systems directly on the internet, it's not a hard effort for an attacker to do something like this.
Dr. Chris Nyhuis, who is CEO of Vigilant, vigilantnow.com, their website, and you are listening to Issues and Ideas. Do other facilities operate with the base of the programmable logic controllers, things like electric grids or even nuclear power plants?
They do, and in this case, especially with the just recent attacks against the two water districts, which were not named publicly yet, and I agree with that approach by the state. But a lot of the attacks, it wasn't what we're starting to hear come out of it wasn't attacks against the software, which was what originally was thought. It's just more attacks against the these directly connected systems. And so, there are, these systems are everywhere, and they're mostly connected because people are trying to get to them remotely, So.
And you mentioned how the more rural areas don't have the tools they need, and you would think that they would turn to the federal government because there is an agency, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, which unfortunately had significant staff cuts in the return of the current administration. I'm thinking back in my radio past when the computers first came into the studios. We kept the CDs in the studio because if the computer crashed, we needed to have the backup. Do these facilities that rely on the PLCs, do they have a backup system, or if the PLC goes down, then that's all, folks?
It all depends. Some, and this goes back down to resources. Some of these PLCs are 15, 20 years old. Some are older, and so in some cases you can't get backups, right? Backup devices. And so they may have a few sitting around. In some cases you have newer ones and you have that. What a lot of these facilities have to do is really have, primary detection capability. You got to remove these from the internet. You got to figure out a different way to get to these systems to control them, right? And that's one of the recommendations from the FBI that's coming out. And I'll say New Jersey has a really phenomenal cyber response unit, and they did an amazing job in this. So kudos to you all on that. But they have to remove those things. But then they also need to have the ability to fall back to manual effort because all of these systems can be run manually. And that is what happened in a lot of these cases, like especially in these two recent ones. Water service wasn't disrupted. But I will point out that from what we're seeing come out of this, and especially across, the more than 300 attacks we've seen across water districts here recently, is that it wasn't the detection systems that found the threat. It was that the attacker was changing IP addresses or I would even say making themselves known, which is a very interesting fact about this, because if an attacker wants to come in and disrupt the United States water districts or things like that, or do something even more nefarious like poison water, they're not going to make themselves known as easily as these attackers did. And there's something to that.
And it's important to know, too, in New Jersey, as you mentioned, we had a good response because one small area in the northwest part of the state supplies water for 2/3 of the state. So if that's unnamed, for you listening, I think you kind of know what we're talking about. But for that officially unnamed source, if that goes, that just shows the magnitude of how a small attack can have a lasting impact.
Huge.
Talk about Vigilant and the services you provide.
Yeah, so we do cyber warfare, and we do cyber warfare efforts down to in organizations like water districts, like manufacturing, healthcare, across the gamut. The way in which we do that is we have technology that can deploy into company environments. It's a physical device, and then we create we collect a lot of data from within inside an infrastructure, and then we can pull data from 155 other data sources that are out there. So pretty much anything anyone can send data to us, we can collect. And if we don't have the ability, we can add that within 2 hours. So we take all that information together. We have a security operations team that constantly is looking at that information and assisting our clients in finding threats. And we're the industry average right now is about 287 days to find a threat, which means that hackers can be inside of an infrastructure for almost 9-11 months. We're able to find them in about 4 hours. So It's much, much faster. Yeah.
Find out more at vigilantnow.com. Chris Nyhuis, thanks so much for helping us understand that this is not something to brush off. It is something that needs to be responded to, and hopefully those who are responding will have the tools they need from people like yourself and others.
Yeah.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure. Can I add one more data point that I think would be important to your listeners?
Absolutely.
You have an extra second? So there's a couple of things here, and this is what we always tell people is, one of the things that when we're in war, and the United States is not used, the United States public is not used to being in war, like you said at the beginning. We're not used for it being here. And one of the things that when we're ever in war is a war tactic by someone we're in war with will try to do is to create fear and chaos. And that's a very important thing to be aware of, is especially with water, it scares us. And in these cases, they didn't poison water systems. They didn't even try to take it down. They just tried to, adjust. They actually even made themselves known, right? And so that generally is a tactic of that fear tactic, right, when we see it. So, it is important to be aware that that we're vulnerable in these situations, but know that. The other thing is we have to be really careful attributing it to an attack group specifically. So, like, in this case, we were very quick to say it was Iran. And in cyber attacks, one of the things you want to do last, and in most cases you never can actually get to, is who actually did it, because it's extremely easy to make what you're doing look like it's someone else. And it's in this case we have to be really careful to attribute it to Iran, because it's highly likely, in my opinion, that it's probably not them, and it's probably someone else that's trying to drive us as a public into war deeper, right? And so we just need to be really careful when we see these attacks come out and attributing them to a specific country, because it literally, like, this type of attack could have been carried out by one person sitting at their house in Italy if they wanted to, right? So this isn't, and they could make it look exactly like it was coming from Iran, or they can make it look like it was coming from the U.S. So I think as a country, we have to be better at understanding that, how warfare works, but also understanding that we need to try to take a lot of the emotion out of what's happening. So, as hard as that is.
You can even add to it that it could be someone who is sympathetic for, in this case, Iran, or it could be someone who's seeing the opportunity and the door opening, as you would, to make things better for, pick your actor, Russia, China, any of the above. Mm-hmm. But there could be a connection between all of these. Mm-hmm. But as you point out and you told us here, figure out the what first before you get to the why. Mm-hmm. And then,
exactly right.
It's prioritizing. That, again, is what Vigilant helps people understand, too. Thanks again, Chris.
Yeah. Oh, my pleasure. Thank you. Have a good day.
If you're listening to us via your favorite podcast platform, make sure you follow and subscribe. Edwin Lopez Corneo died while in ICE custody at Delaney Hall in Newark, New Jersey. When tragedy is repeatedly caused by either one person or one entity, the question has to be why. Why is this happening? Why is this being allowed to happen? Why isn't there an effort to prevent it from happening yet again? All these questions should be asked of the leadership of the Department of Homeland Security and ICE, as the deaths caused by their actions or lack of actions continue to increase. We're now at the point, by the way, where ICE now even tries to hide a death when it occurs. We'll get to that in a minute, too. Joining us to examine all this and talk about what needs to be done, along with by who, is staff attorney with the ACLU of New Jersey, Molly Linhorst. How are you today, Molly?
I'm great, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Find out more about this issue and other points of focus of the ACLU of New Jersey. It's ACLU-NJ.org. So for the person listening who might not be clued in completely to this, other than my opening sentence of the introduction, talk about what unfolded and how Edwin Lopez Corneo became another victim of ICE.
Sure thing. So Delaney Hall is an immigration detention facility in Newark, New Jersey. It is run by a private prison company called Geo Group. So these are folks who are held in what is supposed to be civil detention, non-punitive detention. But Delaney Hall, from that we've heard from so many different people inside and their family members, it has rampantly horrible conditions, inhumane conditions, lack of medical care, really medical neglect of food that people find to be inedible, abuse by guards, horrible sanitation. It's a facility that has a lot of horrible conditions. And most recently, we heard about the devastating death of Mr. Lopez Corneo, and he is unfortunately not the first person to die at Delaney Hall. And there was also more recently a death that I believe you're referencing, Chris, of someone who started to have a medical episode while at Delaney Hall and then was conveniently released from ICE custody on his way to the hospital so that that death would not be counted as a Delaney Hall death. But we are seeing deaths at Delaney Hall, which is always devastating, and consistent reports, and a long, long record now of horrible conditions inside. So unfortunately, it's not surprising that we're seeing people get seriously ill or even pass away from conditions at Delaney Hall.
And we have the first of the 3 deaths at Delaney Hall was back in December of last year. John Wilson Brutus, 41-year-old migrant, died within a day after entering Delaney Hall, died of, well, they're saying natural causes, but he suffered some sort of medical emergency under ICE custody. And what you referenced, too, with that, well, the still unnamed death that took place in July, is that ICE saying, well, it's not our fault because that person wasn't in our custody at that time? Is that what they're trying to claim?
That's right, yes. And this actually is a result of a rule change. Previously, DHS also had to report on deaths that occurred within 30 days of someone's release from ICE custody. That recently changed so that they do not have to report those recent deaths that could be attributable to someone's time at Delaney. So it appears to be a very intentional decision to not be held accountable for deaths that really originate in custody.
Now, as far as Mr. Lopez Corneo, his condition wasn't secret. This wasn't something that just came on, a cardiac episode, for example. He had a few health issues, epilepsy, blood pressure, among others, and he required medication. And I'm saying this only because when access is given for inspections of Delaney Hall, we get 2 separate observations from Democrats who go in versus Republicans who go in. And even from both, before they get in, they have to give, I believe it's 48 or 72 hours notice, so ICE can clean up their you-know-what and make it look as good as possible. But yet the Republicans say, well, I see no problem here, even in light of 3 deaths so far, and I'll even add that we know of. That's right, yeah. And congressional representatives are supposed to be able to access these facilities to conduct an important part of their jobs, which is oversight. But increasingly, ICE is placing conditions on and restrictions on when they can access the facility, where they can go, who they can talk to, and that's become a serious concern. But you're absolutely right. We're getting different sorts of reports. But I will say from all the individuals, all the representatives who consistently go in, Representative Menendez being one of them, as well as Representative McIver, we are hearing the same stories, and they reflect the stories that we hear from individuals inside who we talk to or whose family members share information with us, and also anecdotally sharing that that they tend to get the folks inside to clean up more when they know that there is going to be a more official visit. So it's a huge concern for accountability. And, we're grateful for the individuals, the representatives who take the time to consistently go and who try to enforce their right of access to these facilities, because that is so important to have honest oversight right now. There aren't other sorts of mechanisms for people to get inside. And there have also been severe restrictions on visitation by family members. Granted, those visitations are very limited in terms of the areas of the facility they can access, so it doesn't provide much insight. But the increasing restrictions for people going in, either for family visitation or by congressional representatives, really just make us wonder why they want to be so restrictive in terms of access. What are they hiding? Oh, exactly. They're attempting to hide, and they hope that the deaths don't reveal what they're trying to hide. We're talking with Molly Linhorst, who is staff attorney with the ACLU of New Jersey, ACLU-NJ.org, their website, and you're listening to Issues and Ideas. You made mention, too, that Delaney Hall is owned and operated by Geo Group, who is one of the handful of groups making a ton of money off of these operations, with another one back on the planning stage in Roxbury, New Jersey. Who has legal responsibilities for these facilities? Is it the owner-operator, or is it the ICE staffing who are they just trying to claim, hey, we just work here, it's not our problem?
That's a great question. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the federal government is responsible. They are contracting with individuals or with different companies like Geo Group and CoreCivic to run these operations, but folks in those private companies are operating as agents. So the buck stops with the federal government. They are also the ones who are deciding to detain people and deciding how to do that, and through these private contracts, which, by the way, these private companies owe much more to their shareholders, or believe they owe much more to their shareholders than to the people in their custody. So they are putting profits over people, and that's something that the federal government is deciding to do and encouraging by entering into these private contracts.
Now, we should say in total transparency, at least on this side of the equation, that Mr. Lopez Cornejo was in the country illegally. He had been deported and brought and re-entered the United States. But if I understand the laws correctly, that's not even the equivalent as far as severity according to the law as serious as a first offense DUI. Isn't that a misdemeanor?
I mean, you make the important point that most of the people in these facilities are being held there. They're all being held there for civil offenses, right? Not criminal. The majority of people at Delaney don't have any criminal contact whatsoever. 70% have no criminal convictions. But regardless of what their history is, they're there as civil detainees. They are not supposed to be held in punitive conditions. And regardless, detention is not supposed to be a death sentence. The degree to which the federal government chooses to detain people in order to carry out what are really administrative proceedings is not ever supposed to rise to the level of someone passing. So regardless of Mr. Lopez Cornejo's history, he should not have died at Delaney Hall.
I know what I'm about to say is going to bother some people, but everyone who has feet on American soil, according to the U.S. Constitution, is afforded due process and civil rights. Like it or not, go hold a seance and take it up with the Founding Fathers.
That's right, yes. It's really important for us all to remember that. Every person here has constitutional rights no matter what.
I want to do a fast compare and contrast. When you look at what is unfolding, continues to unfold at Delaney Hall, as far as policy, operation, care, conditions, how does that compare to how prisons are given oversight, and what consequences happen to state-run prisons, for example, if something like a death takes place there? Is there a huge imbalance between these two ideas?
Absolutely, yes. There is a lot more oversight at these criminal buildings and facilities, and a lot more that the public can do really to hold those facilities accountable. There's a lot more access than we're seeing what folks currently have in ICE detention facilities. And, you know, the ACLU has consistently, throughout its history, also been concerned about conditions in pretrial jails and in prisons. By no means should conditions be poor in any of these facilities. They have to meet constitutional standards. But what's different about immigration detention is that it is civil detention, right? It is not supposed to be punitive, like I've said, and that means that standards cannot be at the level of what standards are in criminal prisons. But we do see that there is significantly more oversight and more transparency with pretrial jails and prisons. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. There could absolutely be more transparency and absolutely more accountability. But right now, we're seeing such a stark comparison between the two, given the lack of access in ICE detention facilities.
So what could be done to change this? I know that Representative Rosa DeLauro down in Washington, she's the ranking Democrat in the House Appropriations Committee, is talking about closing down or defunding Delaney Hall. We know now that everything that Mark Wayne Mullin said at his Senate confirmation hearing was totally bogus, and the promises he's made about visiting and talking to people equally as bogus. And it's great that Governor Sherrill is creating safe protest areas, because we've seen ICE agents even attack American citizens. Certainly saw that in Minnesota numerous times, too, to the death of American citizens. What are the hopes, the realistic hopes that could change the situation that we're seeing right now?
There's a lot of different things. I think first, what you first mentioned, Delaney Hall should be closed. And there is always, like I mentioned before, there's always this inherent conflict when a private prison company is running a facility like this, because they are going to put profits over people, which means cutting corners with healthcare. And that's exactly the sort of thing we're seeing at Delaney Hall. So Delaney Hall should be closed. People should be released. There is no reason for people to be detained like this in order for them to be processed through their administrative proceedings. By and large, what we're hearing is that there are people like asylum seekers, people who are going to their check-ins with ICE, who are going to their immigration proceedings. They are the folks who are being caught up in this and who are being detained. And that's in order to meet certain numbers that the federal government is putting out there in terms of numbers of detention. And honestly, it leads to greater profits for companies like Geo Group and CoreCivic. So, A, close Delaney Hall. B, why are we using private companies to house people in facilities like this? And then, in terms of oversight, we need to continue to demand that our representatives get access to facilities like this without severe restrictions like what we're seeing. Same thing with family visitation by friends, loved ones, pastors, in some cases, school administrators, because there are students now who are being detained in these facilities. And making sure that, like what Governor Sherrill is pursuing with the case against Delaney Hall to seek access for health inspectors, making sure that local and state regulations are followed inside these as well. But there's also a significant amount of work being done at the federal level to really ensure that there's oversight to cut down on the people who are being detained, and to try to, at the end of the day, create a better system that is humane, that treats people with dignity, and that doesn't line the pockets of these private prison companies with individuals who are just trying to seek safety and protect their families.
For you listening, as we close out the segment here, here's a little homework for you to do. Look at your whatever investment platform you have at work or 401k IRA, and look at what companies you're putting your money into. I got a feeling you might be surprised that Geo Group might just show up, or one of these private prison companies and ICE detention center companies might just show up. And if they do, I'm not saying don't invest anything anymore, but shift your plan over to something that's equal to your rate of return right now, and take your money away from the people who are playing a significant role in creating the situations which led to the death of Edwin Lopez Corneo. Learn more about this issue and the other points of focus of the ACLU of New Jersey. If you're listening on the stream, it's aclu.org, but in New Jersey, aclu-nj.org. Molly Linhorst, thanks so much for helping us see the truth and understand the importance of demanding answers. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me and for covering this.
The Trump administration has been cutting, even eliminating, federal funding for research projects at colleges and universities. Instead, the administration wants federal funds to go to private companies looking to do research and ideas that the administration sees as priorities and agrees with. The defense of this policy change, in part, is that universities are doing, you know the word, woke research, and they're being left unchecked, unsupervised. Is that true? My next guest is here to share his expert insight into research at universities. He is a professor and chair of the Department of Chemical and Sustainability Engineering at the University of Rochester. He's also host of the podcast Molecular Podcasting, author of the book Science Nonfiction, Behind the Scenes in University Research. Dr. Darren Lipomi, how are you today, Doctor?
Doing well, Chris. Just Darren is fine, thanks.
All right. It's rochester.edu to find out the educational opportunities at Rochester University, and lipomigroup.org. Learn more about Darren's life. You can also listen to his podcast, all major podcast platforms. Your book provides two insightful ideas, and they are intertwined to be sure, but even if someone's not interested in the world of science and gaining into that realm, your story, I think, helps people understand the value of knowing a path, trying a few things along the way. Don't limit yourself by any means, and the role that a trustworthy mentor can serve. Talk about your path from into science in this case. What did you see as needed on your part in devotion and dedication?
I grew up outside of Rochester, New York, in a small town that was surrounded by cornfields in every direction, and there weren't a lot of people in my family who went to college, and I was a big nerd. I grew up on Star Wars and Star Trek, and I wanted to make lightsabers and the transporter and warp speed and tricorders possible. And so I viewed science as the only legitimate route to magic. It all looked like magic to me. And so I didn't know at the time that you needed to do a lot of school. So I was in school for 11 years after high school, learning how to keep good records, how to do experiments, how to work with my hands, how to make molecules and materials. And then eventually I discovered that there were many areas that my skills were useful toward. And one of those was in rehabilitation of swallowing function in cancer patients. Another is the manufacture of solar panels and battery materials. And another area that we're very excited about is in haptics, so using materials that we synthesize in the lab to understand and manipulate the human sense of touch. And I've had the opportunity to work with organizations like the U.S. Air Force, and also with organizations like Sigma Z, which is a scientific advocacy organization. I've received an award from President Trump, but I've also had an experience where my work was called out by Ted Cruz's Senate committee for being woke, and so it's been an interesting life. A lot of contradictions, but a lot of joy and the ability to work with smart young people and to hopefully get some new knowledge out in the public.
Through your experience, having gone through various universities and various aspects of your work, how has the structure of research within universities changed over the years?
I started my undergraduate research when I was at Boston University, and it strikes me that there was a little bit less competition, I would say, for research grants. You know, if you look at papers and grant proposals that were written 20, 30 years ago, I don't believe that many of them would be funded now. There is much more competition. The standards for rigor and what we call preliminary data are so strong that there are some people who would tell you, maybe to get a rise out of you, that when a scientist submits a grant, they're getting the money for work that's already been done because the standards are so high for reproducibility and, let's say, de-risking. I did my PhD at Harvard in the Department of Chemistry, and I was largely insulated from the fundraising aspects as a graduate student, but I did do things like prepare figures for grant proposals for my advisor. I did a little bit more of that when I was a postdoc in chemical engineering at Stanford. And then it wasn't until my 12-year stint as a professor and associate dean at UC San Diego that I was really involved in proposal development. And now at University of Rochester, things really have become more competitive. And it's not just that we're competing with ourselves, or with each other, I should say, with other scientists to get our ideas funded, but we are competing on an unstable platform where you can get a grant funded or nominally recommended for funding, and then that funding can be pulled at the last second. Sorry, administration priorities have changed and this funding is no longer coming through. Let me give you an example.
Sure.
So there is a student in my group who happens to be deaf, and she was part of a National Institutes of Health training program for deaf individuals, and that program was discontinued in the early part of 2025. We had another proposal that was funded by the Department of Energy on electronics sustainability, so making materials that would allow you to take solar panels and other electronic devices apart so that you don't need to mine new rare earth materials. And that program was discontinued for 18 months until the Iran war, when it looked like, presumably, we need to look for more ways of developing alternative energy, so some of those programs got funded. And now we have to rehire for that project. Now, there's another grant that was recommended for funding, which was designed to train students from parts of the country that don't have access to research labs. So these are universities and colleges in rural places where we invite them to University of Rochester to do research in our research labs, and that is designed to expand access to scientific education and technical training. And that program was recommended for funding, and then we got an email a few days ago saying, sorry, it's not going to be funded after all due to a shift in priorities. So it's not only has the competition increased, but also the uncertainty has increased.
So with Dr. Darren Lipomi, Professor, Chair of the Department of Chemical and Sustainability Engineering at the University of Rochester, author of the book Science Nonfiction Behind the Scenes in University Research, and you're listening to Issues and Ideas. With funding, as I referred to back in the introduction, being redirected to a degree by federal funding outlets, what's the risk for university research now? You talk about how, do you have to shift your selling focus? Do you have to push more on here's where we will wind up as opposed to here's the idea where I hope will get us to where we wind up? How is this going to change research with the universities already being a little more choosy in what they see as priorities now?
One of the biggest risks that we face is the disincentivization of students to want to go into science because it is much harder to get a funded PhD position. So a PhD student in the sciences and engineering, they receive their tuition benefit, but they also receive a salary, and I think some people would be surprised to hear that. So they are part worker, part student. In terms of the way that the uncertainty has affected the research projects in which we engage, I would say that there has been a triangulation to try to anticipate what priorities are going to be of the administration, or to cast ideas that we're qualified to work on in terms that would be palatable to funding agencies. So if, for example, you have a new material that allows you to recycle solar panels by snapping your fingers, you can dissolve a solar panel or dissolve all the glue and recycle the silicon and all the other materials. That description is kind of left coded, right? It's this environmental application, but on the other hand, you could take the same scientific approach. You could answer exactly the same scientific questions. How do you encapsulate electronic materials that, in addition to silicon, also have indium and germanium and cobalt and all of these conflict minerals and minerals that are controlled by governments that either have human rights abuses or with governments with which we do not have strong political relationships, or that we would rather have a domestic source of these materials, then you're shifting the argument from something that's green coded to something that's domestic production coded. So you can do the same research, but frame it in a different way. And is that disingenuous? I don't know. It's an open question. The fact is that it is useful in both areas.
No, and it's for the greater good. It's just a matter of the perception of what that good is, depending on who you are trying to secure funding from and what you're looking for funding for. We have to wrap up here, but for you listening, I'm sure many people have always asked the question, well, what's the importance of research being done at universities? Is it money better spent? Some people jokingly will say spend it on the sports as opposed to the research, but that's another talk for another time. But I think with what Darren writes in his book, Science Nonfiction, it gives you that understanding of the value of impartial, truly focused on priorities that will serve others through discovery and through research and through development. Without the research, the other things that bring ideas to life, to get to that life, you need the foundation. That's what research is all about. And again, free to find true, honest, and factual research, not preferential research like some are trying to urge to have happen. Again, the book is Science Nonfiction, Behind the Scenes in University Research. He is a professor at Rochester University. Learn more about their learning opportunities, rochester.edu. You can also find out more about Darren at lipomigroup.org. And be sure to listen to his podcast, Molecular Podcasting, wherever you listen to your podcast, whatever platform that may be. Darren, thank you for giving us an understanding of a valuable part of all our lives. It's the beginning stage of those parts, but it's an important stage. And thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Chris.
You used to work with a guy who, when you were talking with him, he'd repeat the last, 2, maybe 3 words of your last sentence in order to make you believe that he was actually listening to you. He wasn't. And we all knew this, but he thought he was fooling everybody. Comedian Steve Smith, in his Red Green character, tells a story about how he was sitting at the kitchen table having breakfast with his wife when he suddenly realized she'd been talking to him for over 20 minutes, which Red had been completely oblivious to, and she asked him, "So how does that sound, okay?" Red went into sudden defense mode, said, "Sure, honey," and that's how they wound up with new living room furniture. Hearing and listening are important to God and expected of you. This is made clear several times in Revelation, where Jesus, in dictating letters to John for the 7 churches, what idea does Jesus keep including? Jesus says this to the church in Ephesus in Revelation chapter 2, verse 7. "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will give to eat from the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God." Says this to the church in Smyrna in Revelation chapter 2, verse 11. "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death." As well as this to even what's referred to as the dead church of Sardis in Revelation chapter 3, verse 6. "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches." And by the way, did you catch how there are blessings associated with hearing. Now, these words weren't a new idea that Jesus debuted in Revelation. He spoke these very same words in Matthew chapter 11, verse 15. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. In the 9th chapter of Mark, where it taught about the command for us to be listeners via what's referred to as the transfiguration of Jesus. This was when Jesus was with Peter, James, and John, and as we read in verse 3, his clothes became shining exceedingly white, like snow, such as no launderer on earth can whiten them. And that was followed by Moses and Elijah appearing and talking with Jesus. 3 disciples were obviously confused by all this, but God clears it all up. In Mark chapter 9, verse 7, and a cloud came and overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud saying, This is my beloved Son, hear him. Jesus proved the power of listening in Matthew chapter 4, verse 4, when Satan was tempting Jesus to turn stones into bread, and Jesus responded, but he answered and said, It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. For us to grow strong in faith, we're not to listen to false teachers, idolaters, people like that. Paul in Romans chapter 10, verse 17, instead gives us this instruction. So then faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. It's important to understand, too, that the listening that will lead us to a greater faith and bring us closer to God is a spiritual hearing, not just physical hearing. Let's go to what Paul writes in Galatians chapter 3, verse 2. This only I want to learn from you. Did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law or by the hearing of faith? Now, what are we to be listening for? Jesus gives us this answer in Luke chapter 11, verse 28. But he said, More than blessed are those who hear the word of God and keep it. We are to be listeners of truth and knowledge, as Jesus tells us in John chapter 16, verse 13. However, when he, the Spirit of truth, has come, he will guide you into all truth, for he will not speak on his own authority, but whatever he hears he will speak, and he will tell you things to come. Spiritual listening keeps us connected to God's will and his wants of us. Here's how this is told to us in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 1. Therefore we must give the most earnest heed to the things we have heard, lest we drift away. If we don't hear what we hope for from God, that's a warning that there's a disconnect, and we're the cause of it. Jesus in John chapter 8, verse 47 tells us this, He who is of God hears God's words, therefore you do not hear because you are not of God. But if you continue to immerse yourself in God's word through prayer, study, Jesus will be there waiting for you as he promises in Revelation chapter 3, verse 20. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and dine with him and he with me. Finally, it's important to build and establish our spiritual hearing so that not only we'll hear God, but God will hear us. We learn about this in 1 John chapter 5, verse 14. Now this is the confidence that we have in him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. As well as in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 12, For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayers. Think of it this way, just like in that phone service TV commercial, God wants to know, can you hear me now? Don't forget to check out our website, issuesandideasradio.com. We have more information about the guests who are here on the show today. All throughout the site, features, links, entertainment. You'll find it all at issuesandideasradio.com. And if you've been listening to us via your favorite podcast platform, make sure you follow and subscribe. Thank you, as always, for being a part of what we do here each and every time. Look forward to being with you right here this time next week for our next edition of Issues and Ideas.